To anyone looking in from the outside, my life looked like something out of a magazine spread. A beautiful home in the suburbs, a husband with a good job, a mother-in-law who volunteered at church every Sunday. People used to stop me at the grocery store and say, "You're so lucky, honey, you really landed on your feet." I smiled every single time. I was very good at smiling. My husband, I'll call him my husband because that's what he was, even if he forgot he proposed to me on a Tuesday. Not a special Tuesday, not our anniversary, not my birthday, not even a weekend. A Tuesday in February in the parking lot of an Olive Garden because we'd just had dinner and he said the words almost like he was asking me to pass the salt. "I think we should get married." I said, "Yes." I don't know why I'm still embarrassed about that. I was 28. I had a job I loved, project coordinator at a mid-size marketing firm downtown. I had my own apartment, small but mine, with a window that caught the afternoon light just right. I had a savings account, a gym membership I actually used, and a group of girlfriends who made me laugh until my stomach hurt. Within 18 months of saying yes in that parking lot, I had none of those things. It didn't happen all at once. It never does it? It was small requests, small suggestions. My mother-in-law thought it would make more sense financially if we moved into the family home. She had the space, we could save for a house of our own. My husband thought it was a great idea. I thought it was temporary. I packed up my apartment and told myself 6 months, maybe a year. That was 3 years ago. The job went next. Not because anyone fired me, because my mother-in-law needed help around the house, because my husband's schedule was unpredictable, because someone needed to be home. "You can always go back to work later," my husband said. "We make enough." He said it so reasonably. He said everything so reasonably. I handed in my 2 weeks' notice and cried in my car the whole drive home, and then I walked inside and made dinner and nobody asked me how I was feeling. I want you to understand what those 3 years felt like before I tell you what happened, because I think sometimes people hear stories like mine and they think, "Why didn't she just leave?" And the honest answer is that I forgot I was allowed to. I forgot what my own voice sounded like when I wasn't apologizing or explaining or making myself smaller so everyone else could be more comfortable. I forgot that I had been once a person with opinions and plans and a savings account. My mother-in-law ran the house like a general runs a base. Her kitchen, her rules, her schedule, her standards. If I folded the towels wrong, she refolded them in front of me without saying a word, just that look, patient, pitying, the way you'd look at a child who keeps spilling her milk. My husband saw everything. He said nothing. That was the thing about him that took me longest to name. He wasn't cruel, he was just absent. Physically present, emotionally checked out, like a building with all the lights off. I started to notice things about a year before everything fell apart, small things at first. He stayed late at work more. He started being careful with his phone, not secretive enough to be obvious, just careful. A certain screen angle when I walked into a room, a pause before answering when I asked a simple question. I filed these observations away the way you file away receipts you're not sure you'll need, just in case. Then one evening in March, while he was in the shower, his phone lit up on the nightstand. I wasn't snooping, I was walking past, but I saw the name and I saw the first 2 lines of the message and my whole body went very, very still. Her name was Danielle. I didn't know a Danielle, but apparently my husband knew her quite well. I put the phone back exactly where it was. I went downstairs. I made tea I didn't drink. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the dark, and what I felt wasn't what I expected. I expected devastation. What I felt instead was something much quieter, almost like clarity. Like the moment your eyes finally adjust and you can see the shape of the room you've been standing in all along. I didn't say anything, not yet. I needed to think. I needed to be smart, because here is the thing they don't tell you about being financially dependent on someone. It isn't just love that traps you, it's logistics. I had no income, my name wasn't on the mortgage. I had maybe $400 in an account my mother-in-law didn't know about, money I'd been quietly setting aside from grocery change over the course of 2 years. $400 and a college degree that had been sitting unused long enough to gather dust. So I did what I should have done 3 years earlier. I made a plan. I called my friend Renee, my oldest friend, the one who'd been gently, carefully worried about me for years without ever pushing hard enough to push me away. I called her from my car, parked 2 blocks from the house, engine running. I told her everything. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just said, "Okay, what do you need?" Over the next 6 weeks, Renee helped me update my resume. I applied for jobs online using her address. I opened a new bank account at a different bank. I started quietly, carefully gathering documents, my social security card, my passport, copies of our joint financial statements, anything I might need. I kept everything at Renee's house. I told no one, and I waited. My husband, meanwhile, had grown bolder. The late nights became more frequent. He started traveling for work or saying he was traveling for work. He bought new clothes. He seemed genuinely happier, the particular happiness of a man who thinks he is getting away with something. My mother-in-law noticed the change in him and credited it to less stress at work. I nodded and cleared the dinner plates and said nothing. Then one Thursday evening, my husband came home and sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, with that reasonable, infuriating calm of his, that he had invited a colleague to stay in the guest room for a few weeks. Her company was doing renovations on her apartment building, he said. She needed somewhere temporary. He hoped that was okay. I looked at him for a long moment. "Of course," I said, "whatever you need." His shoulders dropped about an inch with relief. He'd been bracing for a fight, I realized. He didn't know me very well anymore. Danielle arrived on a Saturday afternoon with 2 designer suitcases and the kind of easy confidence that comes from being very beautiful and knowing it for a long time. She was maybe 30, dark hair, the sort of smile that lands differently on a husband than on a wife. My mother-in-law was charmed within approximately 4 minutes. She said Danielle reminded her of someone, she didn't say who. I thought about pointing out that Danielle reminded her of nobody who belonged in this house, but I smiled instead. That first week was a particular kind of humiliation that I will not fully describe because I don't want to give it more space than it deserves. There were looks exchanged across the dinner table that I was meant to see. There were comments, gentle, plausibly deniable comments about my cooking, my clothes, my apparent lack of ambition. My mother-in-law began, subtly, to defer to Danielle in household conversations, the way she used to defer to no one but herself. My husband laughed at Danielle's jokes in the easy, unguarded way he hadn't laughed around me in years. I smiled. I was still very good at smiling. What none of them knew was that on the previous Wednesday I had accepted a job offer. Marketing manager at a firm across town, more seniority and better pay than the position I'd left 3 years ago. The start date was in 3 weeks. Renee and I had found an apartment, affordable, close to work, available the first of the month. I had spoken briefly and discreetly to a family law attorney, a calm woman named Patricia who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and spoke about asset division the way other people discuss weather forecasts, matter-of-factly, with occasional mention of what to expect. Everything was in place. I was waiting for the right moment, what I had not planned and what I want to be honest about, because the best parts of this story were not my doing, was Marcus. Marcus was Renee's cousin. I had met him once at her birthday party 2 years earlier before I'd retreated so far into that house that I stopped going to birthday parties. He was in town for work and staying at Renee's place for the weekend. When I came over one Saturday to drop off some documents, he was in the kitchen making coffee and we talked for an hour and a half at the kitchen table without either of us noticing the time. He was easy to talk to, he was funny without trying to be, he asked me questions and actually listened to the answers. I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in so long I'd almost forgotten it had a name, like myself. I want to be clear about what Marcus was and was not. He was not a rebound, he was not a plan, he was not leverage. He was a person who treated me like I was worth talking to, and at that particular point in my life that was almost shockingly rare. We exchanged numbers, we texted. It was new and cautious and neither of us pushed it anywhere, but when everything happened he was there, and that matters. 2 weeks after Danielle moved in, my mother-in-law announced she was hosting a small dinner, a few neighbors, a family friend. A chance for everyone to get to know Danielle better, as though the rest of us needed a formal occasion for something that had been happening in my kitchen for 14 days. I agreed because I agreed to everything in those days, and I also agreed because I had realized somewhere in the quiet of the previous week that this dinner was going to be the moment. I texted Marcus. I explained briefly, honestly, that I was about to close a chapter of my life and I could use a friendly face. He didn't ask a lot of questions. He said, "What time?" I told him 7:30, a little after dinner started, because I wanted him to walk in at exactly the right moment. I didn't know what the right moment would look like. I trusted I would recognize it. The dinner was exactly what I expected. Danielle wore a red dress. My mother-in-law had made her famous pot roast, which she had not made for my birthday in 3 years. My husband poured Danielle's wine before he mine. The neighbors were warm and oblivious, talking about the new development on Route 9 and whether the elementary school was getting new soccer fields. I sat at the table that I had set and ate the food I'd helped prepare and watched my own marriage take place without me, and I thought soon. At 7:25 my phone lit up. Marcus outside. I stood up, touched my napkin to my mouth and said I'd forgotten I'd invited a friend tonight. I hope that was all right. My husband's eyes went to me briefly with something that might have been surprised. My mother-in-law looked as though I'd announced I'd rearranged the furniture. Danielle said nothing. She was looking at her wine glass. I went to the front door and opened it. Marcus was standing on the front step in a jacket holding a bottle of wine I hadn't asked him to bring, and he smiled when he saw me the way that people smile when they're actually glad to see you. I stepped aside and said, "Come in," and he did. I watched Danielle from across the room. I watched her the way you watch something you want to remember precisely, the way you watch the end of a film you know you'll never forget. I watched her glance up when we walked back into the dining room. I watched the glance become a stare. I watched the color shift in her face, not to red but to something more interesting, a kind of blanched, trapped pallor, like she just heard a sound she couldn't explain. Then she said it quietly, not a scream the way I'd imagined, but a word that dropped into the room like something heavy. "Danielle." Marcus stopped walking. He looked at her the way you look at someone you haven't thought about in a while and then suddenly can't stop thinking about. "Danielle," he said. His voice was entirely even. "What are you doing here?" The table went very quiet. The neighbors exchanged a look. My mother-in-law set down her fork with a small, careful click. What unfolded in the next 10 minutes I could not have scripted. Danielle and Marcus had been married. Past tense. Barely. Their divorce had finalized 4 months ago after she had, according to the very calm and factual way Marcus described it later, moved out of their apartment to pursue, as he put it, other arrangements. He had not known what those arrangements were. He had not known whose house she was staying in or why. He had apparently suspected she was seeing someone. He had not suspected he would be standing in that someone's dining room on a Thursday evening with a bottle of Merlot. My husband was not saying anything. He had gone very still in his chair, the way people go still when they're trying to figure out whether the thing happening is actually happening. My mother-in-law was looking at Danielle with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Uncertainty, slow and searching, like a foundation discovering it's on soft ground. Danielle stood up from the table. She said she could explain. She looked at Marcus, then at my husband, then at my mother-in-law, then just once briefly at me. I looked back at her pleasantly. "I need to use the restroom," she said, and she walked out of the dining room, and 30 seconds later I heard the front door. My husband pushed back his chair and stood up. He said her name once toward the direction she'd gone, then he sat back down. He didn't go after her. That somehow was the saddest thing about him I had ever seen. Not the cruelty, not the lies, but this, that when the moment came, he just sat back down. The neighbors made their excuses about 20 minutes later with the polished, hurried grace of people who have witnessed something they'll be talking about for the next 6 months. My mother-in-law started clearing the dishes. Nobody spoke about what had happened. I found that almost funny. I went upstairs and I finished something I had quietly started 2 nights before. I packed a bag, one bag, not because that was all I was taking, but because that was all I needed for tonight. The rest was already arranged. The apartment, the job, the documents at Renee's house. 3 years of patience quietly assembled into an exit. I came back downstairs with the bag over my shoulder. My husband was in the living room. He looked at the bag and then at me, and for the first time in a very long time I felt like he was actually seeing me. "Where are you going?" he said. "I'm leaving." I said, "We should talk about this." "We should have talked about this years ago," I said. "I have an attorney. Her name is Patricia. You'll hear from her next week." He started to say something. I saw his mouth open and then he stopped. Maybe he saw something in my face that told him there was no version of this conversation where I changed my mind. Maybe he was just tired. I don't know. I stopped needing to understand him somewhere around the 6th week of Danielle sleeping down the hall. My mother-in-law standing in the doorway to the kitchen. She was holding a dish towel. She looked for the first time in 3 years like she didn't know what to say to me. I thought about saying something pointed, something that would land. I decided against it. She was going to have enough to think about. "Good night," I said. I walked out the front door and I didn't look back, not because I was being dramatic about it, but because there was genuinely nothing back there I needed to see. Marcus was still in the driveway. I hadn't asked him to wait. He had anyway. "You okay?" he said. I stood there for a second in the cool night air and took stock. I had one bag. I had a new job starting in 11 days. I had an apartment key on my keychain and an attorney named Patricia and a friend named Renee who had never stopped believing I was going to find my way back to myself. "Yeah," I said, and I meant it in a way I hadn't meant a simple answer in a very long time. "I really am." He drove me to Renee's that night. We talked the whole way, the easy, unforced way of people who have something real to build, not something desperate to cling to. I didn't cry until I got inside and Renee hugged me, and then I cried for a while, not from sadness exactly, but from the specific relief of putting something down that you've been carrying so long you forgot it wasn't supposed to be yours to carry. The divorce was not simple. Divorces never are. Patricia was as calm and methodical as advertised, and my husband was more cooperative than I expected, possibly because he was dealing with his own reckoning. Danielle, it turned out, had been seeing 2 other people alongside him. The irony of a man being cheated on by his mistress was not lost on me, and I will admit that I allowed myself exactly one very quiet laugh about it alone in my new apartment before closing that chapter entirely. I started my job on a Monday morning. I took the train in. I wore a blazer I'd bought with the first paycheck from my new account, and I sat at a desk that was mine in an office where nobody needed me to be smaller, and I opened my laptop and I started. That was 8 months ago. I want to say one thing directly to anyone listening who is in the middle of their own version of what I just described, not the mistress part, not the dinner party twist, but the part that comes before all of it. The 3 years of making yourself small, the gradual giving away of your job, your money, your friendships, your own name on your own accounts, that part. You are not stupid for staying. I was not stupid for staying. We do what feels survivable in the moment, and sometimes survival looks a lot like stillness, and stillness can look a lot like giving up, but it isn't always. Sometimes it's just waiting until you've built enough of a foundation to stand on. But here's what I know now. The foundation has to be yours, not his, not theirs. Keep your job or get it back. Keep your accounts or open new ones. Keep one friend who tells you the truth even when you don't want to hear it. These things are not small. These things are everything. Renee says I sound different now. I asked her different how, and she thought about it for a second and said, "Like you again." I told her I'd take that. I'll take that.